The lecture hall held 300 beings, but you could have heard a microbe divide. Professor Vadgir's voice rolled through the amphitheater like distant thunder, each word delivered with a scalpel's certainty. His massive frame dominated the podium, 8 feet of slate-gray exoskeleton that caught the sterile light in angular reflections. 3 crimson eyes, arranged in a perfect triangle across his broad face, moved independently as he surveyed his students. No one met his gaze directly.
"The Battle of Alto Strift,"
he said, and a holographic star system materialized above the stage. Red and blue markers showed fleet positions frozen at the moment of catastrophe.
53 vessels, 9,312 lives. All lost because Commander Herol questioned her orders for 19 seconds.
The recording played. A Threnody commander's synthesized voice crackled through subspace interference. "High Command, the stellar readings don't match our models. Request permission to—" Static. Then nothing. Vadgir's central eye fixed on the empty space where the fleet had been.
19 seconds of hesitation. 19 seconds during which the enemy repositioned. 19 seconds that transformed victory into extinction.
He turned back to the class, all 3 eyes now scanning the terraced rows of students.
The commander's error was in her death. It was in the thought that preceded her action. Dissent, even in the mind, is the seed of chaos.
He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle like sediment in still water.
Is this clear?
300 beings remained silent. This was a statement, not a question meant to be answered. Everyone knew that. The axiom of assent was absolute. Every entity had its place in the universal hierarchy, and questioning that place was the first step towards systemic collapse. You didn't challenge Vadgir any more than you'd challenge gravity. A hand rose. The motion was so unexpected that for a moment, no one processed it. Then, understanding rippled through the hall like a shockwave. Durag Threx, a bulky draconid in the 3rd row, turned his craggy head so fast that stone dust flaked from his neck joints. Across the aisle, Silavrin, felinoid ears swiveled forward, her gray fur bristling with sudden attention. The hand belonged to the human. Caleb Haynes sat in the middle tier, his arm raised with the same kind of deliberate calm that suggested either absolute confidence or complete ignorance of danger. It was unremarkable by human standards. Brown hair, brown eyes, the slightly worn jumpsuit that marked him as an exchange student. What made him remarkable was what he was doing. Vadgir's 3 eyes converged on him with the weight of a collapsing star. The silence stretched, broken only by a wheezing respirator and the click of Garvani's scales against their chair. The atmospheric processors hummed their mindless tune, the only sound that dared to continue. Vadgir's voice could have frozen hydrogen.
"You have something to add?"
Caleb stood. The motion was smooth, but he gripped the edge of his console to steady himself. His voice, when it came, carried across the amphitheater with surprising clarity. "Professor, with all due respect—" He paused, and in that pause, 300 beings held their breath. "That's wrong." The words hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Durag's rock-like features cracked into an expression of pure horror. 2 rows down, a cluster of Hissaudian students, Vadgir's own species, recoiled as if Caleb had just announced his intention to eat their young. Someone's datapad clattered to the floor. The sound, a loud gunshot in the quiet. Vadgir didn't move. His stillness was more terrifying than any rage could have been.
"Wrong."
He tasted the word like an unfamiliar wine.
"You believe that the axiom of ascent is wrong?"
Not the axiom itself, Caleb said. His hands were steady on his datapad, but those watching closely could see the pulse jumping in his throat. Your interpretation of Commander Haral's failure.
Elaborate.
One word. An invitation and a threat wrapped in 4 syllables. Caleb's fingers moved over his datapad, tapping the surface to pull up the stellar radiation readings. Gravitational fluctuations and a subspace interference pattern without wasted motion. May I access the tactical archive? Vajir's left eye twitched. The Hesiodon equivalent of raising an eyebrow. He gestured minutely toward the holographic display. New data overlaid the star system. Caleb highlighted specific anomalies in yellow. Commander Haral wasn't questioning orders out of dissent, he said. He was observing a stellar phenomenon that hadn't existed when High Command issued those orders. Look. He zoomed in on the radiation signatures. Solar flare eruption, magnitude 9, occurring 90 seconds before a transmission. High Command was operating on data that was already obsolete. He pulled up another overlay. The enemy fleet didn't reposition during her 19 seconds of hesitation. They repositioned during the solar flare, using it as cover. By the time Haral received her orders, the tactical situation had already changed. Her hesitation was the only thing that might have prevented the defeat, if she had, been allowed to finish her report. Sila's tail lashed once. Her predator's mind recognized the hunt unfolding before her. This was a direct strike at the foundation of everything Vajir taught. The professor's middle eye narrowed.
You presume to reinterpret 3 centuries of accepted analysis based on what qualification exactly?
Pattern recognition? Caleb replied. Some humans are particularly good at when we're allowed to look at all the data instead of just the data that confirms what we already believe. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Someone whispered a prayer in Old Threnody. Vajir descended from the podium. Each step was deliberate, his massive frame moving with an economy that made him seem to glide rather than walk. He stopped 3 meters before Caleb, close enough that the human had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact.
You accuse me of confirmation bias.
I suggest, Caleb said carefully, that the axiom of ascent, like any theoretical framework, might benefit from periodic stress testing against their edge cases.
Edge cases?
Vajir's voice had dropped to a register that made the walls vibrate.
You consider the death of 9,000 beings an edge case?
I consider it a tragedy that might have been prevented if Commander Haral had been trusted to make decisions based on real-time data instead of being required to follow orders based on outdated information. The two stood frozen. A tableau of impossible confrontation. Student challenging master. Chaos challenging order. Human challenging the galaxy's most feared intellectual authority. Vajir's head tilted 5 degrees. A motion on a Hesiodam that indicated either deep thought or preparation to strike.
Class dismissed,
he said. 300 beings didn't need to be told twice. The exodus was swift but silent, nobody wanting to draw attention to themselves. Durag glanced back at Caleb, his disgust warring with a nascent concern. Sheila lingered near the door, her ears flat against her skull, clearly torn between self-preservation and curiosity.
Not you, Mr. Haynes.
Caleb remained standing as the hall emptied. The doors sealed with a soft hiss, leaving them alone in the vast space. Vajir returned to the podium, his back to Caleb. The holographic display still showed the Alphos drift disaster, frozen at the moment of annihilation.
Do you know why the humans were admitted to the Aegis Academy?
He asked. To determine if we could integrate with galactic civilization?
No.
Badger manipulated the display, pulling up a different image. Earth. Blue and green and achingly fragile against the star-dusted dark.
You were admitted as a test of our systems. The Aegis Council wanted to know if our systems could withstand exposure to your particular brand of cognitive contamination.
He turned, all three eyes focusing on Caleb with laser intensity.
Humanity's history is a catalogue of chaos. You war against yourselves. You change allegiances like clothing. You improvise when you should plan. Adapt when you should persist. Question when you should obey. By every metric the Axiom uses to predict societal collapse, your species should have self-terminated millennia ago.
And yet here we are, Caleb said.
Yes, here you are. A paradox that threatens the foundation of everything we have built.
Badger moved closer, his shadow falling across Caleb like a shroud.
You stand in my classroom and tell me that I am wrong. Do you understand what you have done?
Questioned your interpretation of data?
You have challenged the axiom itself in front of 300 witnesses.
Badger's expression changed. A flicker of interest, far more dangerous than anger, crossed his features.
If I expel you now, the story ends. The human challenged authority and was removed. Order is maintained. But if I allow this challenge to stand,
others might start questioning too. Caleb finished.
Precisely.
Badger circled him slowly, a predator considering prey.
So I will offer you something far worse than expulsion. I can give you exactly what you've asked for. The opportunity to prove your position.
Caleb's jaw tightened. How?
3 days from now, you will present a formal counter-argument to my interpretation of Altos Drift. Not to me alone, but to the entire Academy. Every student, every professor, the Dean herself. You will have access to all tactical archives, all historical data. Present your case with sufficient rigor, and I will consider revising my analysis.
And if I can't?
Then you will publicly acknowledge the superiority of the axiom of ascent, accept your failure, and withdraw from the Academy. Your failure will be entered into the permanent record as the definitive proof of humanity's cognitive incompatibility. I will personally ensure that the Council sees my report.
The weight of it crashed down on Caleb's shoulders. Not just his academic career, but humanity's future in the galaxy, balanced on his ability to win an argument against the greatest mind in the ages. Caleb thought of Captain Corliss, of the Martian colonies, of 19 seconds they might have saved 9,000 lives, if someone had just allowed them to think. I accept. Caleb's quarters were Spartan even by Academy standards. A bed, a desk, a single window looking out onto the terraformed moon's sterile landscape. He sat in the dark. The only light coming from the holographic display floated before him. Captain Kalani Corliss's face stared back at him, frozen in the last frame of her final transmission. She'd been beautiful the way that competence made people beautiful. Sharp eyes that missed nothing. Silver streaking through black hair she refused to dye. Laugh lines that suggested she'd found joy even in the hardness of frontier life. She'd been his mentor, his teacher, the one who'd shown him that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was follow orders. He played the recording. Mars Control, this is Corliss at Colony 9. Your evacuation timeline is wrong. Her voice was steady despite the alarms blaring in the background. I'm looking at cascade failures across 3 atmospheric processors. The seismic data your models are using is 6 hours old if If we follow standard evacuation procedure, we're going to be routing people directly into the collapse zone. The response came from a man whose face Caleb had memorized, whose name he'd never speak aloud. Captain Corliss, you will follow established procedures. The models have been verified by... The models are wrong. For the first time, emotion cracked through her professional calm. I'm not theorizing. I'm looking at real-time data. The northern route is already compromised. If you would just look at what I'm sending... Captain, you are in violation of emergency regulations. Evacuate via northern route immediately or face... The feed cut to static. Seismic event. Total structural collapse. 437 colonists, including one Captain Kalani Corliss, who had been right about everything except the possibility that anyone would listen. Caleb closed the recording and opened the Althos' drift archives. 3 days to prove that sometimes questioning orders wasn't chaos, it was survival. It got to work. The strategic doctrine hall could hold 1,000 beings. Today, it held 1,200. Word had spread through the academy like a contagion. A human who'd challenged Vajir, the exchange student who'd told the professor he was wrong. They packed the terraces, filled the aisles, clustered around the doorways. Even faculty who hadn't attended a student presentation in decades had emerged from their offices. Dean Epar occupied the place of honor at the chamber's apex, her containment suit of spun metal refracting the slow swirl of energy that comprised her true form. The ancient being's presence elevated what might have been academic theater into something far more consequential. Vajir stood at the primary podium, his posture suggesting absolute confidence. He'd worn his formal academic robes, layers of geometry that made him look even more imposing than usual. Caleb stood at the secondary podium, looking very young and very human in his simple gray jumpsuit. The format is traditional, Vajir announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. The challenger will present their interpretation. I will respond. The dean will moderate. Questions will follow. His 3 eyes fixed on Caleb. Begin. Caleb touched his datapad. The holographic display exploded into life. Not just one star system, but dozens. The Battle of Althos' Drift reveals a pattern the Axiom of Ascent systematically fails to recognize, because recognition would require acknowledging that sometimes hierarchical command structures create their own failures. He highlighted 9 battles spanning 3 centuries. In each case, field commanders observed conditions that contradicted High Command's operational data. In each case, they were ordered to ignore their observations. In each case, disaster followed. The display shifted to show communication logs, response times, data packet analysis. The average communication lag between field positions and High Command in these engagements was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The average time for environmental conditions to change significantly in combat situations is 2 minutes and 12 seconds. This means that by the time High Command receives information, processes it, and sends orders, they're operating on data that already is obsolete twice over. Sela leaned forward in her seat, her predator's instincts recognizing the elegance of the attack. Drog sat rigid, his expression unreadable as stone. But the Axiom of Ascent doesn't account for this lag because it assumes perfect information flow through perfect hierarchies, Caleb continued. The Axiom of Ascent treats any deviation from orders as chaos. The truth is that it's adaptation to reality. He pulled up biological comparisons. Every successful species in the galaxy has localized decision-making capabilities. Biological brains don't route every decision through a central core. Hive species maintain distributed processing nodes, even plants. He highlighted a flowering specimen from Hesiodon's own ecosystem. Adjust their growth patterns based on immediate environmental feedback rather than some kind of predetermined blueprint.
You compare military command to vegetation.
Vajir's voice cut through the presentation like a blade.
The axiom of ascent governs socio-military structures, not the physical sciences. A star does not care for your opinion, but a civilization does.
A ripple of nervous laughter swept the audience. I compare successful systems to successful systems. Caleb replied, his voice even. The only difference is that one admits to adaptation while the other calls it chaos. He brought up Earth's military history. Operation Market Garden, 1944. Rigid adherence to a plan despite changing ground conditions. Failure. The Toyota production system, which revolutionized manufacturing by giving line workers the ability and the authority to stop production when they spotted problems. Success. The Columbia disaster, where engineers' concerns were overruled by administrators. Failure. The Apollo 13 rescue, where ground control explicitly deferred to the astronauts' immediate observations. Success.
Cherry-picking examples,
Vajir countered.
Minor objections that have been raised by theorists in the past, but never with sufficient rigor. For every success to insubordination, I can show you 1,000 failures.
And show me one where the failure was predictable based on information available to field commanders but ignored by the hierarchy. The challenge hung between them. Vajir's fingers moved across his interface, data flowing at tremendous speed. The audience watched in fascination as the galaxy's greatest tactical minds searched for a counterexample. Minutes passed. The only sound was the hum of the hall's life support. Every being watched Vajir, their attention a physical weight in the room. Finally, Vajir stepped back from his podium.
You have prepared thoroughly.
I had a good teacher, Caleb said. She died, following orders that everyone except High Command knew were wrong. He brought up Corliss's image, the Mars colony collapse, laid out in brutal detail. The cascading failures, the obsolete models, the 19 minutes and 43 seconds which correct action could have saved everyone. If only someone had been allowed to take it. This is why humanity seems chaotic to the ages, he said. We've learned through bitter experience that sometimes the most dangerous thing that you can do is assume the person above you knows better than the same on the... We question not because we're insubordinate, but because we buried too many people who didn't. Dean Ipar's containment suit pulsed with light, a gesture requesting attention. Professor Vajir, your response? Vajir stood silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice lost its usual certainty.
Mr. Haynes has identified anomalies in the historical record, edge cases where the axiom's predictions failed to account for information lag and environmental volatility.
He paused, and something shifted in his bearing.
However, these remain statistical outliers. The axiom of ascent has prevented far more disasters than it has caused.
How would you know? Caleb asked. If the system punishes anyone who questions it, how could you know how many disasters were averted by those who obeyed out of fear? You're measuring success by an absence that you created.
Order prevents chaos.
But it sounded like a recitation, devoid of conviction. Order prevents change, Caleb countered. And in a universe where conditions change constantly, a system that can adapt is already dead. Just hasn't stopped moving yet. The debate continued for 3 hours. Datasets were dissected, methodologies challenged, assumptions stripped bare. The audience watched in rapt attention as human chaos and Hesiodon order collided again and again, each impact revealing new fractures in what they'd thought were unshakable truths. Finally, Dean Ipar raised a hand sheathed in spun metal. Sufficient data has been presented. Professor Vajir, your assessment. Vajir's 3 eyes closed, a gesture so unusual that several Hesiodons in the audience gasped. When they opened, they fixed on Caleb with a look of grudging respect.
Mr. Haynes has demonstrated that the axiom of ascent, as currently formulated, contains a critical assumption about the information perfection that does not align with observed reality. While I maintain that hierarchical order remains essential for civilization, I concede mechanisms for localized adaptation may be necessary in specific circumstances.
The hall erupted. Students talking over each other, faculty members arguing, a dozen languages creating a chaos of sound that would have horrified Vajir under normal circumstances. Dean Ipar's suit flared with brilliant light, silencing the room. The debate is concluded. Mr. Haynes, your challenge is noted and validated. You will continue your studies. The ancient being's attention turned to Vajir. Professor, I believe curriculum adjustments may be warranted.
Yes,
Vajir said slowly, the words seemingly pulled from somewhere deep within his rigid certainty.
I believe there may.
A week passed. The Academy's rigid routines reasserted themselves, but the dynamic in the classrooms was different. Students asked questions in classes where questions had never been asked. Professors found themselves defending positions they'd never had to defend. The humans' challenge had created ripples that spread through the institution's structure like cracks in ice. Caleb was reviewing tactical scenarios in the library when his datapad chimed with a priority alert. Across the room, every other device activated in unison. The message was short and terrifying.
Containment breach, Sector J88. Gray Swarm contingency activated. All personnel to emergency stations.
A secondary diagnostic followed. Breach cause listed as cascading failure originating from a miscalibrated pressure regulator during the last maintenance cycle. A tiny error, magnified by a rigid, automated system until it broke. The Gray Swarm. Self-replicating nanites designed for large-scale mining operations, contained by multiple redundant safeguards that made the breach seem unthinkable. Theoretically, a breach was unthinkable. Caleb ran for the command center, joining a stream of students and faculty. The main display showed the asteroid belt, where a silver cloud was expanding exponentially, consuming everything in its path. The swarm had already devoured 3 asteroids and showed no signs of slowing.
Estimated time to lunar intercept,
a technician reported, her voice tight with controlled panic.
6 hours, 14 minutes.
Professor Vajir stood at the primary command station, his massive frame radiating authority.
Implement standard containment procedures. Activate all defensive grids. Route all communications to this station. No action without authorization.
The Academy's defenses came online. Energy weapons, particle shields, interceptor drones. Everything the Aegis had developed to fight wars against thinking enemies. The swarm ate through them like acid through paper.
It's learning,
someone whispered.
How can it be learning?
Gray swarms are reactive, not intelligent,
Vajir said.
Each destroyed nanite relays data, allowing the collective to adapt its composition and behavior. It does not think, it merely optimizes. Maintain firing patterns. It cannot adapt to what it cannot predict.
But it did. Of course it did. The swarm had no strategy, no plan. It simply responded to stimuli with perfect efficiency. Each destroyed nanite teaching the collective what to avoid. Each successful consumption teaching it what to seek. 4 hours, 3 hours. The defensive perimeter collapsed inward as the swarm pressed forward. A tide of silver death that learned from every encounter.
Sir,
a subordinate ventured.
Perhaps we should consider alternative strategies.
We will maintain discipline.
Vajir cut him off.
Order is our strength. Continue standard procedures.
Caleb watched from the observation deck with Sela and Durag. The felinoid's furs stood on end, her every instinct screaming danger. Durag's rocky features had developed stress fractures. Thin lines spreading across his jaw.
He's going to get us killed.
Sela hissed.
He's following the axiom.
Durag replied, but doubt colored his words. Caleb studied the swarm's patterns on his datapad, watching how it moved, how it responded. He saw it move like water finding cracks, like fire seeking fuel. We're fighting it wrong, he said suddenly. We're fighting it as an opponent. We should be treating it as a hostile environment. Sela's ears pricked forward. What do you mean? Look, he pulled up the engagement data. Every time we've hit it with concentrated fire, it disperses. Every time we spread our attacks, it concentrates. I'm not choosing these responses, it's following gradients. Energy gradients, mass gradients, path of least resistance.
So?
Durag rumbled. So, we don't fight it, we guide it. Caleb's fingers flew across his interface, pulling up the Academy's maintenance fleet. Small, fast ships. These skiff have disproportionately large energy signatures from their reactors, but almost no mass. The swarm is drawn to energy, but it consumes matter. To it, these ships are irresistible lures, but terrible meals. If we send them out in random patterns, creating false gradients, we could lead it away. Sela finished, her predator's mind immediately grasping the concept. Like using decoys to lead predators from the den.
That is insane,
Durag said.
It violates every regulation. Vajir would never.
Vajir is about to let everyone die rather than admit that his system isn't working. Caleb interrupted. He keyed a quick encrypted message on his datapad. A simple code phrase sent to 9 of the students from the informal discussion group that had formed after his debate. Alphos's Drift, Bay 9, now. He looked back at Durag. Look at the projection. 2 hours until impact. The defensive grid was down to 40% effectiveness and falling. We need to move, now. Getting to the maintenance bay required bypassing the lockdown. Caleb found the answer in the Academy's own rigid structure. Emergency systems designed for external threats, with exploitable internal overrides. A localized power surge, carefully calibrated, convinced the system that environmental controls had failed in Section C7. The magnetic locks disengaged just long enough for them to slip through. They made it 3 corridors before Durag caught up with them.
Stop.
His massive frame blocked the passage.
This is treason.
This is survival, Caleb shot back.
The chain of command exists for a reason. Without order.
Without order what?
Sela interrupted, her claws extending reflexively.
We might accidentally save ourselves?
The axiom has protected the galaxy for millennia.
Durag insisted.
The axiom is killing us right now.
Caleb pulled up the system schematic on his datapad, but he didn't show Durag the swarm. He showed him a classified incident report. A loss of the Draconid scout vessel Stone's Honor. 78 of your people. High Command called it an unprovoked attack. A lie. They were ordered to ignore sensor readings of gravimetric shear, just like Haral was. It was an edge case, and they buried it. Durag's face contorted, duty warring with the damning evidence in front of him. The official story had been a cornerstone of his training. A tale of heroism against a treacherous foe. Your choice, Caleb said quietly. Follow the rules that killed them and die with honor, or break them and live with purpose. The Draconid stood frozen for 10 long seconds. Then, with a sound like grinding stone, he stepped aside.
If we're doing this, he growled, we do it right. I know the maintenance procedures. There's a geological survey override in Bay 9, code locked to Draconid engineers. It allows for emergency launches during seismic events, bypassing central command. It will give us 10 minutes before anyone can stop us.
They ran. In Bay 9, the 9 other students were already waiting, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. Durak moved to the main console, his thick fingers typing a complex series of commands. Alarms blared and then fell silent.
Override engaged. 10 minutes.
The maintenance skiffs weren't designed for combat. They were utility vehicles, fast, nimble, with powerful reactors for running repair equipment, but minimal shielding and no weapons. Perfect for what Caleb had in mind. "Remember," he said over the comm as 12 skiffs launched in violation of every regulation the Academy had. "No patterns, no formations, pure randomness. Make the swarm chase ghosts." They scattered like a handful of thrown dice, each pilot following their own chaotic inspiration. Seela's ship danced through space in spirals that defied any logical formula. Durag, surprisingly, proved adept at randomness, his rigid thinking making his attempts at disorder genuinely unpredictable. The other students flew in patterns that would have failed any tactical assessment. The swarm responded immediately. Its perfect, deadly advance wavered. Tendrils of silver reached toward the erratic energy signatures, the reactive system struggling to calculate the optimal paths for targets that had none. "It's working," someone breathed over the comm. From the command center, Vadir watched his ordered defense crumble while a handful of regulation-breaking students achieved what his entire defensive grid couldn't. His 3 eyes tracked the chaotic dance, seeing patterns his rigid philosophy said shouldn't exist. "Sir," a technician reported, "should we target the unauthorized launches?" Before Vadir could respond, Dean Iphar's energy-filled suit materialized beside him. "No. They're in violation of... They are saving the Academy." The ancient being's energy swirled in what might have been amusement. "Your system has failed, Professor. Let us see if their chaos succeeds." Caleb led the swarm toward the one thing he'd noticed in all the stellar charts: a gravitational anomaly between J88 and a smaller moonlet, where tidal forces had created a pocket of unstable space. "Durag," he called. "You took advanced geology. What's the composition of that moonlet?"
Mostly iron, but there's a massive thulium deposit near the equator in a state of constant instability. Why?
The Draconid's voice cut off as understanding struck.
The magnetic resonance. The frequencies of the repair lasers. If we hit it with the right frequency...
We could trigger a resonant cascade and generate an EMP pulse big enough to fry every nanite in the cloud. Caleb adjusted his heading. "All these ships converge on these coordinates. We get one shot." They dove toward the moonlet's surface, the swarm following like a silver tsunami. At the last possible second, Caleb gave the order. "All ships, full power to repair lasers. Target the thulium deposit. Modulate the frequency 8.3, now!" 12 beams of coherent energy struck the same point. The moonlet's crust cracked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the thulium deposit destabilized. The magnetic field it generated collapsed and reformed in a nanosecond, sending out a pulse of electromagnetic radiation that turned the local space into a brief, brilliant star. The swarm died instantly. Trillions of nanites, their delicate systems overloaded, became nothing more than expensive dust floating in the dark. The Academy's Great Hall had never been so silent. Caleb stood before the assembled faculty, flanked by his fellow mutineers. Professor Vajir loomed behind the primary podium, his expression unreadable. Dean Ipar presided over it all, her radiant form casting rainbow reflections across the walls.
You violated every regulation,
Vajir said.
Abandoned your posts, ignored the chain of command, acted without authorization.
Yes, Caleb agreed.
By the axiom of ascent, you should be expelled. Your actions were chaos incarnate.
Yes.
And yet...
Vajir paused, and in that moment, Centuries of certainty cracked like ice in spring.
Your chaos saved 12,000 lives. My order would have killed them all.
He stepped away from the podium, approaching Caleb with slow, measured steps. When he spoke again, his voice carried something it never had before: uncertainty.
I have spent 3 centuries teaching that order prevents chaos, that hierarchy prevents collapse, that the axiom of ascent is the only wall between civilization and destruction.
His 3 eyes closed, then opened, focusing on Caleb with terrible intensity.
You have proven that sometimes the wall itself becomes the danger.
He turned to address the assembly.
The humans' actions were anarchic, insubordinate. Correct.
The last word fell like a hammer.
The axiom of ascent is incomplete. It requires adjustment.
The silence that followed was deafening. Vadir, the immovable pillar of order, had just admitted fallibility.
Mr. Haynes, he continued, your earlier challenge proved that rigid hierarchy fails when information flow is imperfect. Today's events proved that it fails catastrophically when facing adaptive threats. These are critical variables to be incorporated into the axiom, not outliers to be dismissed.
He did something no one had ever seen. He extended his hand, a gesture he'd learned from studying human customs.
You will work with me to develop what we shall call the Axiom of Ascent, 2nd edition. One that acknowledges chaos as a necessary companion to order.
Caleb took the offered hand, feeling the cool, hard surface of Vadir's exoskeleton. I'd be honored, Professor.
Do not be honored. Be prepared. The Aegis Council will resist this change with every tool at their disposal. We will need to prevent arguments so compelling that even their rigidity must bend.
Something that might have been a smile crossed Vadir's features.
Fortunately, I now have evidence that humans excel at making the unthinkable seem inevitable.
The next morning, Vadir's classroom was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the academy and beyond. The professor who never changed was teaching something new. Caleb stood beside the podium, still feeling somewhat surreal about the whole situation. Vadir surveyed the crowd with his 3 eyes, then began.
The Axiom of Ascent states that every entity has a defined place in the universal hierarchy. This remains true.
He paused.
However, the assumption that this place is static, that has been proven false. Adaptation is a critical variable in a dynamic system, distinct from pure chaos.
He pulled up a new holographic display. Instead of rigid hierarchies, it showed flowing networks, nodes that could shift and reconnect based on changing conditions.
The human variable,
he continued with a trace of humor,
has taught us that the most robust order incorporates change. This requires a higher form of discipline, beyond simple obedience.
A hand rose in the audience. A young Hesiodon, probably terrified but unable to resist.
Professor, doesn't this contradict everything the axiom teaches?
Vadir's eyes swiveled to focus on the student.
Yes,
he said simply.
And the rigorous analysis of that contradiction will be our work. Mr. Haynes.
Caleb stepped forward. Well, think of it this way. The old axiom is like a skeleton. Rigid, structural, essential for support, but a skeleton without flexibility will shatter under pressure. What we're proposing adds connective tissue to the existing structure. Ligaments that let the structure flex without breaking.
But how do we know when to be rigid and when to adapt?
Another student asked.
That,
Vadir said, his voice regaining its familiar thunder,
is the question that you will spend your careers answering. For the first time in 3 centuries, I do not have a prepared text. We will build the new doctrine together, through disciplined inquiry.
He turned to the class, and his next words would have been impossible just weeks ago.
Who has an initial hypothesis to challenge?
Every hand in the room went up. Selah caught Caleb's eye from her seat. Her ears flicked forward, a gesture of amusement he now recognized. Durag sat in the front row, his rocky features still showing stress fractures from their desperate flight, but his posture had changed. He held himself like a warrior ready to think, not merely a soldier awaiting orders.
Then let us begin,
Vadir said.
The galaxy has operated on absolute certainty for too long. It is time that we learn the discipline of productive doubt.
As the discussion erupted around them, Caleb thought of Captain Corliss. She had died because no one would listen to her questions. Maybe, just maybe, they had built something from her sacrifice. A future where questions weren't treason, but necessity. Where adaptation wasn't chaos, but survival. The Academy had feared Professor Vadir for centuries. Now it would learn to respect something far more powerful. A Professor Vadir willing to admit he might be wrong. And a human student who proved that sometimes being wrong was the first step to being right. Outside the vast windows, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small revolution taking place in one classroom on one small moon. But revolutions, Caleb had learned, didn't need to be large to be significant. Sometimes they just needed to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right person willing to raise their hand and say the unthinkable. Sometimes, "That's wrong" was the most powerful phrase in any language. The galaxy's growth, if not its future, depended on it. And growth, as both order and chaos would eventually agree, was the only true constant in the universe.